now. Welcome everyone to the Digital News Report 2020 Asia Pacific launch event. My name is Federica Cherubini. I'm the head of leadership development at the Institute. And I'm really happy today to be joined by our lead author, Nick Newman, who's going to take us through some of the main findings, and then we'll have a discussion with Premesh, Chandran, CEO and founder of Malaysiakini. Welcome, Premesh. And we'll be soon joined by Yvonne Chua, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of the Philippines. This year report, Nick will tell us more, is including 46 markets all over the world. We'll give it over to Nick now for a presentation of the main findings. And of course, this session is all about what is most relevant for the Asia Pacific area, but of course, with some learnings from other parts of the world. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. And I'm going to pick up on not only the findings of the report, but also some of the differences between this region and other parts of the world in terms of consumer behavior and the media landscape more generally. As Federica says, we have 46 markets, media markets this year, which is an expansion from last year as part of our mission to bring data and evidence to more countries around the world. So we added Indonesia, India, and Thailand this year, and then the Philippines in 2019. So together with Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and Australia, that brings us to a total of 11 media markets in the region. Just a word about the methodology. This survey is based on an online poll. So as such, it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behavior, such as television, print, and radio. And this is particularly important in markets like Indonesia and the Philippines, for example. You can see they're only around 70% of internet penetration. So we need to be a bit careful when comparing data, say, with South Korea or Japan, where pretty much everybody is online. Polling was conducted on our behalf by the research agency YouGov, working with partners in January, early February this year. And we have samples, as you can see, they have around 2,000 in each market. The report is supported by 14 different organizations, including the Google News Initiative, the BBC. We have academic partners in many countries around the world, industry organizations and media regulators too. So our last poll was in January 2020, so just before coronavirus hit, really. And then this year, we did a poll at a time when the impact varied considerably across countries. In terms of sort of restrictions on movement. So we're sort of really comparing before coronavirus and after coronavirus, but obviously not at the peak. And so it's just worth bearing that in mind in terms of those two different points in time. And what we see in this first chart is one of the most important sort of longer term effects. It's been on the consumption of printed newspapers in pretty much all countries around the world because of those difficulties of distribution and access. So there was also a lot of concern in the early stages about whether you could pick up the virus physically from the newsprint. And so as a result, we see very significant falls across the world. I've just picked out a few countries, including Malaysia in orange. And in many countries, you know, that is an acceleration of a long-term trend. Also the Philippines, Hong Kong, Australia, other examples where we've seen very significant falls in print. And of course, because so many media companies in Asia still rely so much on the income from print, either direct sales or advertising, this is having a devastating effect on finances and indeed the employment of journalists across the region. In terms of online usage, it's up in some countries, down in others. But one of the really interesting, again, I suspect enduring features of this crisis is that we're becoming even more dependent on the smartphone. Again, I've picked out Malaysia as an example. You know, twice as many now say that they access news through their smartphone as via a computer. And these trends, if anything, have accelerated over the last year. It's worth noting that even before the crisis, access to the news in many Asian countries was much more heavily focused on the smartphone than, for example, in Europe or other parts of the world. So 85% in Indonesia, 81% in Thailand, 78% in the Philippines. And part of this is driven by extremely low costs of mobile data in some parts of the region. And again, I think what the implication of that is, it is probably pushing in Asia more visual formats, more video news, for example, and more social media than in some other parts of the world. We'll see that later. One piece of good news, I think, this year, and again, this is likely to be a COVID effect, is we've seen a significant increase in trust in news over the last year. So 44% across our whole sample of more than 46 countries say they trust most news most of the time. So that's up 6 percentage points, reversing to some extent the decline that we've seen in recent years. So this may be sort of the fact that COVID coverage has been, fact and evidence-based, a lot of it. It may be that COVID news has squeezed out some of the sort of partisan politics that quite often undermines trust. At the same time, we've seen that trust in distributed environments like search, social media, remains significantly lower, and the trust gap has grown, again, sort of suggesting this flight to more reliable information. And if we look at that on a country level, so at a market level, you can see quite big differences across the region. So at one end, you've got sort of Thailand, Singapore, about half, these are not great numbers, but about half, so they trust most news most of the time. But around a third, only around a third in South Korea, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And interestingly, in all of the countries where we have comparative data from last year in the region, trust is up. And in many cases, as you can see there, quite considerably. In terms of benchmarks, I've shown a few European countries on the left here. And again, quite a big range there between Finland on the one hand and UK on the other in Northern Europe. It's worth just pointing out the United States now has the lowest trust of any country in our 46 country survey, with only 29% saying they trust most news most of the time. And a lot of this is really due to those really deep divisions and polarization in society over politics, the stolen election, for example, but also over race this year. And I think that's one reason why we see a slightly different pattern in the US. This year, we've also tried to understand in more detail how issues like gender and politics and ethnic background and age play into all of this by asking how fair different groups feel coverage is to them. And we've expressed this in terms of a net score. So people who say it's fair, and then we've taken away people who think it's unfair. So what you see here around politics, for example, just picking up on that US data, is people on the right, these might be Donald Trump supporters, feel the media is really unfair to them. So a net score of -59, whereas people broadly on the left feel the media, that's the pink, feel the media is broadly fair, +17. We see a lot of similar patterns in Spain and in Germany. So politics and political polarization, it makes a big difference in sort of trust scores. We also find age and gender, so young people, women feel the media is less fair, and then differences in terms of where you live. I know this is not Asia, but it's just interesting. We see some similar patterns in some Asian countries too, where there is a real sort of concentration of trust and sense that the media is fair in the capital, so London and the southeast, and then in parts that feel neglected, like in the UK, it would be the northeast. People feel the coverage of them and their region is very unfair. In the US, you can look at the Midwestern states and some southern states, the same sort of pattern. And then we can also look at sort of ethnicity in the US, and not surprisingly, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans feel the media is broadly unfair, it doesn't cover them in a reasonable way, whereas white people broadly think the media coverage is fair. And I think all of this plays into sort of really growing media debates right now about diversity, inclusion, and metropolitan and bias. Another key issue, of course, is rising concern around false and misleading information online. And on average, we find that more than half of our samples around the world say they can't tell the difference sometimes between what's true or false on the internet. They worry about that. That's a bit higher in Africa and Latin America, as you can see, than it is in Asia. But again, there's big differences across the region. So some Asian countries, we find much higher levels of concern about misinformation. And in terms of types of misinformation, we're really seeing, this was primarily around politics, but now we're seeing, the number one concern in many countries now is COVID-19. False information. As you know, many conspiracy theories have been spreading through social media and elsewhere around misinformation. Higher in the Philippines, 63%, and much lower in say, Japan. And when we ask who is responsible for this false and misleading information about coronavirus, it's interesting that people look at domestic politicians primarily mentioned most, followed by ordinary people through sort of sharing information without thinking, for example, activists like anti-vaxxers, and then journalists. There are some people who blame journalists for sensationalizing or not reporting accurately. Again, we can see slightly higher levels of concern in Malaysia and the Philippines if we compare that with, say, Australia. And then in terms of the platforms via which misinformation spread, I think this is really interesting. We see a very different picture depending on which country you're in and what the main social networks are. So you can see that in Indonesia, in India and Brazil, people are much more worried about misinformation, coronavirus misinformation spread through WhatsApp, through these closed messaging apps where it can be harder to spot and debunk misinformation than say Facebook, though Facebook is also important in countries like the US and UK. It's mainly Facebook, and then a different pattern in the Philippines where it's all about Facebook. Facebook is really the main way in which people are consuming news, but also misinformation. So one of the big questions is whether these concerns about misinformation, whether the need for reliable news has increased people's willingness to pay for news online specifically. And if we look at this around the world, we've been studying this for some time, we can see that in some countries, in a few sort of richer countries, predominantly Western countries, we see the proportion who are prepared to pay has increased. So 21% in the US is double what it was in 2016. It's people investing in publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post. We've seen further increases in parts of Europe, particularly those Nordic countries, again, sort of richer countries protected by language in many cases. Whereas in some of the bigger European countries where there is so much free news around, UK, Germany, France, it's much, paying for news is much lower. And we see in Asia also the proportion of people who are prepared to pay for online news is generally much lower. And the reason, which comes up in focus groups, is that the news is literally everywhere. There is so much free news. There's no need to pay unless you are really interested in a specific area. And we'll talk about this later, the sort of rise of aggregators and aggregator apps, again, where news is primarily free, is another reason why people are not currently paying. Of course, one of the barriers to paying for news and building relationships with consumers is the role of platforms and social medias as gateways and destinations. This has been something we've been tracking for 10 years or so. And if you look across countries, and this is a chart where we ask people, how do you prefer to start your news journey? So do you prefer to start with a website or an app? Do you prefer with social media or search? And you can see now that only a quarter on average across all countries say they prefer to start directly with a news provider. So for most people, they are now accessing news via some kind of third-party side door, an aggregator, mobile alert, search, social media. And if you look at under 35s, so younger people, you can see how strong that preference is. So social media and search becomes much, much more important. And it's even harder to build those direct relationships. Only 18% say they prefer to start their news journeys directly with a news website or a news app. Those are averages. And when you look at this across countries and across regions, you see very, very different patterns. So in some countries, for example, in Northern Europe, you have very strong direct behavior. So these news brands still have this direct relationship. 63% say they prefer to start their news journey with a news website or app. And this is often where countries have, where those publishers have subscription relationships as well. However, in many countries, and some of these are in the Asian region, We find a set of countries that we call mainly social, so very strong social behaviors. In the Philippines, for example, around half say they prefer to start their news journey with a social network. Only 8% say they prefer to start directly. We have a set of countries which are a bit more pick and mix. The US, for example, so maybe older people more interested in going directly, younger people more interested in going via social media. And then another set of countries, again, many of these in Asia, which we're calling deeply aggregated, where you have very strong role in the news ecosystem of search engines and portals as the main way of accessing news. So we can think of South Korea with Naver and Daum, for example, sort of homegrown tech companies who play a big part in the media landscape. And then Japan and Taiwan, it's maybe Yahoo News, for example, as well as Line and other aggregators. And it's really interesting to see across the region the importance in Asia of these mobile news aggregators. So the benefit here really is this sort of convenient one-stop shop access to news driven often by sort of popularity-based algorithms. So Line today is very popular in another number of Southeast Asian countries. And then we can see others that are more specific to particular countries like Korea or Japan. In terms of social networks that are used for news, it's also interesting to look at regional differences. So in general, social media plays a bigger role in Asia and Africa and Latin America than it does in Europe or North America. And that is particularly true for YouTube, very high use of YouTube for news in Asia. Incredibly popular in a country like Thailand, for example, but hardly used at all in the UK. Also Instagram, WhatsApp, we're seeing Telegram being used in a number of Asian countries, much more than it was last year. And the other big change, I think, is the rise of TikTok with younger people, which, a few years ago I thought had absolutely nothing to do with news. But over the last year, we've really seen that change. So you can see here across all countries now, a third of 18 to 24s now say they're using TikTok for any purpose, and around 1 in 10 for news. And particularly in Thailand and Indonesia, TikTok, along with Instagram and YouTube, has been used by young people really as a way of expressing their views about politics and social issues over the last year. And we've seen a number of protests that have been really organized through some of these networks. And all of this raises quite a lot of issues for journalists who are really trying to come to terms. Here are a few examples of how do you tell stories in these different kinds of environments. So this year we've been looking finally in a little bit more detail at where people are paying most attention when they're in some of these social networks, whether it's TikTok or Facebook or Twitter. And are they paying attention to journalists, or are they paying attention to other people or politicians or celebrities, for example? So these are averages across all countries, but I think it tells a really interesting story. So in terms of most attention, you can see that it's true that people pay a lot of attention to journalists in Twitter. That's because you have a very, very focused group of people who are interested in news, and journalists don't have it all their own way. Politicians, political activists also take a share of that attention. In Facebook, people are primarily there for other reasons. But again, mainstream media, the presence is expected and they play a significant role. But if you look at some of these youth-focused networks like Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok, it's much more about celebrities, whether that's footballers or comedians or actors or singers, even when it comes to news. And I think this is raising, really interesting challenges for journalists about how to engage with young people in these kind of networks when these are not necessarily networks that they're used to participating in themselves. So finally, our report just carries, and if you sort of pick up a copy of the report or look at it online, we have these great commentaries from experts in the region, and just pulling out a very few themes which may come up in the discussion. So as I mentioned, pretty much everywhere we see print-based media financially in a much more difficult position because of the pandemic. So layoffs, closures, slimmed down versions, slash wages. Secondly, we are starting to see more experiments with new business models, so reader payment, non-profit models, membership models, and it'll be really interesting to see how that develops and what the potential is for those. We're seeing more concern about press freedom following the national security law in Hong Kong, the closure of Apple Daily just last week, was it? Also in the Philippines, ABS-CBN TV, with the franchise not being renewed, so in different parts of the region. Journalists who write critical articles continue to face political attacks across the region, in many cases coordinated online harassment as well, and then increasingly sort of legal action as well. And we're seeing a range of laws or strengthening of laws introduced nominally to clamp down on social media and misinformation, but which also have the potential to silence views online for people who politicians don't like in particular. And we see that in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, a range of countries across the region. So, to set up the discussion, just to summarize some of the things we've been talking about, COVID-19, we think, has sort of accelerated that digital change, putting further pressure on the business models. Are we innovating fast enough? I guess is the question. Secondly, what about that trust premium? So if trust has gone up, what can we do to hold on to that trust? What can we learn from that process? What about those business models and experimentation? What might work in Asia? What not necessarily the same as working in North America and Europe? What about those concerns about different groups and representation and inclusivity? How do we deal with that going forwards? And then engaging with young people, the role of social media, and whether it's possible to strengthen relationships or engage people within those different social networks. What do we need to do differently? So some questions which hopefully we can pick up in the discussion, but I'll hand back to Federica now and the panel.
Thanks so much, Nick. For those who joined a few minutes after the beginning, we're now going to have a discussion with Yvonne Chua and Premesh, Chandran, and Nick as well on the impact of all the fundings of the report, of course, in the Asia Pacific region. A bit of a housekeeping: if you want to send us a question, post it in the Q&A. And we're also on Twitter with the hashtag DNR21. I think, starting maybe from the most obvious of these fundings, which is the impact of the pandemic and how much this, of course, has, compared to previous year, really accelerated things and disrupted things. Yvonne, if I can start with you, you are the author of the country page for the Philippines. Can you tell us what you've seen in terms of the impact of the pandemic in the Philippines?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Nick. Thank you for the presentation. The Philippines is a bit odd when you look at the effects of the pandemic. So like other countries, of course, we felt the closure, temporary or permanent, of certain media outfits. The long lockdown had pushed a lot of Filipinos to go online. But this had also been accompanied by, as Nick pointed out, the closure of the biggest and oldest network. It's all free-to-air stations, both radio and television. So as a result, unlike other countries where the pandemic, because of the lockdown, people were grounded at home, many of them began watching more television, especially television news. The Philippines was deprived of that because of the closure of ABS-CBN in May and its permanent revocation of its, the non-renewal of its, let me correct that, the non-renewal of its franchise in July. So we lost a very significant audience, and we're talking not just any audience, we're talking of news consumption. The survey shows that the drop in terms of the access of ABS-CBN was 21 points. Of course, there was a gainer, and this would be the second biggest network. But its gain is nowhere close to what the ABS had lost, the 21 points. And what worries me more in terms of that is that the loss of audience is felt nationwide, because ABS-CBN, being the biggest network, had, aside from, of course, its presence in Metro Manila had 12 regional offices, 12 out of the 17 regions in the country. So just imagine. And I think if you look at Southeast Asia, television viewership has always been high in the Philippines. And for you to close a network at that time is certainly, of course, depriving people of public interest reporting. I don't even have to mention just how badly affected print was. Circulation really dropped. Newspapers couldn't leave their offices. I mean, we have so far one of the longest and strictest lockdowns in the world. So mobility affected the way journalists went about their work, and of course, the printing and distribution of newspapers.
Do you have a sense, Yvonne, where, are these audiences that are, lost to news, or have they moved somewhere else? Have they moved to other channels?
Well, like I mentioned, I looked at the audience share, and this is not in the Reuters report. I looked at the audience share. Certainly, GMA had enjoyed a lot, right? Reaped a lot from the closure of ABS-CBN, but its increase is not really commensurate to the loss of ABS-CBN. The other networks also earned, like, in terms of audience share, just 0.5% to 0.5% to at most 1 to 2%. That's very small compared to what we had in terms of audience share of ABS-CBN. Of course, ABS-CBN was very prudent enough to continue broadcasting on its pay TV, both cable and satellite, and move towards digital. But it's still not quite the same if you're in a country where, internet penetration is just like 78% according to Reuters, the study, but a bit lower according to some other studies, around 70%. So you have, like, we're looking at 22 to 30% of Filipinos who are not online. So although we did see a shift to online news consumption, it will not quite make up for the loss in TV news audience.
Thanks, Yvonne. Prem, if I can come to you, what, Nick has talked about accelerating, like COVID, accelerating many of the pre-existing trends and really added to the disruption. What have you seen in Malaysia and with Malaysiakini?
Well, Malaysia was a little bit extraordinary because we also had a change of government, which coincided with the start of the pandemic. There was a reversal of trend. We went to democratic change in 2018, but in 2020, it reverted back to a regime close to what it was before 2018. So that was a dramatic shift. I think that, in terms of the major impact, definitely print has faced the brunt of it. Print circulation was really down. Both circulation as well as advertising. The pandemic took hold very quickly, and advertising budgets plunged very quickly. So it's already print was already suffering, and it was very, very tough. So there were massive layoffs in print. Digital was perhaps a little bit less affected. Malaysiakini relies a lot on subscription, and we were able to push subscription hard to make up for the loss of revenue from advertising. So in fact, where previously advertising contributed the majority of revenue, during the subscription, there was a flip. The pandemic is a flip where subscription then became the major revenue earner. But, generally, I think, the COVID, the overall consumption of news increased during the pandemic, but the mix was very large. Like the report said, there's a lot relying on WhatsApp and social media, and a lot of people sharing news which are less than accurate or fake news. And that was, there's been a lot of circulation about the vaccines, whether you should get the vaccine or not, vaccine hesitancy. And because plus we had a government which was not able to confirm the majority in parliament. So there are a lot of questions whether or not the government's actions were in fact, based on data, or whether they were questionable. So you got this, to and fro about misinformation, both regarding politics and COVID, and the nexus between these two areas, which made it very difficult for people to comprehend what's happening and to take action. And by and large, if you look at Malaysia, we are lagging recovery from pandemic. I think the Economist ranked as the lowest country in terms of recovering from the pandemic.
if we want to say like one of these, the thing that the Nick's mentioned, of course, is the raise of the trust levels, maybe also because across the world, because of the need, for people to find information, crucial information, in many cases about even like life or death. And so like in some cases, we've seen a return to a service journalism. So really newsroom thinking about what were these information and user needs most of all. Prem, what did you see in terms of this impact of trust and audiences turning to you for reliable information? Do you feel that it's something that will be easy to maintain? Like what you will have to do to keep that?
Yeah, I think it was also a parameter depending on people needing to know accurate information, because they were being bombarded by too much information from too many spheres, and actually having to go out and actually decipher that. And they found that news media was actually giving the most accurate information, most based, most reference information, and I think the trust grows from there. But I think that this, whether or not it will hold for long is questionable. And I saw Nick pointed out there's very different news consumption trends between the older generation and the younger generation, right? So how do we address that will be a major question. If they are, so you may have more trust on websites, on formal portals, but whether that trust feeling can move over to when they consume media on TikTok, on Instagram, etc. So I think it's definitely it is the news organizations need to adapt so that this trust relationship can be carried forward even when they're not on their own portals or their own apps. And I think that's a challenge. How do you build a trust in a distributed audience environment?
What have you seen, Yvonne, in the Philippines about this?
Well, the pandemic certainly has increased trust in news overall. Before the Philippines became part of the Reuters study, trust had been sliding since Duterte took office. It had been a drastic slide, I think, from a high of 32% extreme trust to a low of 22% in 2019. This is according to another study, a nationwide local study. So what has happened is in the first year, we saw trust still the lowest in Asia among Filipinos, Southeast Asia, and it's still the lowest in the Philippines, but it has increased. And like Prem, I'd like to think that this is because Filipinos realize that to get more accurate and reliable information, you have to go to information that is vetted, and the one that vets it would be, of course, your mainstream media. So that's good. But on the other hand, it still remains low because the thing is, like Lick pointed out, Filipinos consume a lot of news from social media, and the social media is simply awash in disinformation, hateful content, and it bothers people a lot, so you don't know whom to trust. And I also feel that I've come across quite a number of studies that show that a number of Filipinos have a hard time distinguishing what is main legitimate media from those that pretend to be media. So that's another factor on why trust remains low. But I think what we've seen in the figures this year is trust in the media brands themselves, mainstream media, has remained pretty stable, except for the news outlets that the president has continuously demonized. This would be ABS-CBN and Rappler, which each suffered a 4-point drop. So it's something to keep in mind as well, that perhaps if we had removed that factor, that media had been the object of vilification, both by the president and his supporters, offline and online, perhaps trust would be even higher in the media brands.
If I could just add quickly, I think that we also found that although a lot of people are seeking information from brands, there are a lot of people who are captured in this echo chamber. So this whole idea of COVID was very good, a good way to look at people who are being captured in a certain space of information, believing in a lot of theories on COVID, which perhaps have no scientific basis, and other people forced to reckon with scientific ideas. What is mRNA? How does a virus work? What is what ACE receptor? So there are a lot of people who are suddenly actually having the force to actually understand scientific concepts, which were good, but other people really kept on and keep staying in their echo chambers. And I think that is, to a certain extent, news organizations have failed to figure out how do we break into these echo chambers. Why is it such a large amount of people believe in these ideas, but we're not able to penetrate them? So it's become a very self-reinforcing idea. And obviously, it's not just in the past, it's also ahead. For example, if the vaccines don't work, or if this movement controls and lockdowns don't work, if it's shown that the virus was, for example, a man-made or engineered in a lab, there'll be a big blowback against science, against these so-called data-based and scientific ideas. So then those who will say, yeah, I told you so, and it's all a conspiracy, will gain ground. So I think that we're kind of in the middle of it, but we're in a very dangerous situation if the science-based strategies don't work, there will be a huge blowback, and that will also be taken out against media organizations which have kind of echoed science-based thinking.
Prem, what have you seen that works in this area? Like, have you seen some formats, some different ways, some different commissioning? What have you done to address this problem from your newsroom?
We've done a lot of guides and comparing vaccines and trying to give a lot of demystify information. And there is people who are on the borderline, they are able to digest this information and come back to conclusions. So vaccine hesitancy was very high in the early time when vaccine was being rolled out, and that has reduced. But those who are hardcore, there's so much of misinformation. They can live on an entire diet of YouTube videos, fed to them over a WhatsApp group among a particular group that they have, that they refuse to budge. So in many ways, society is becoming very divided. And I think it really takes, how do we, are there more interesting influencers who can reach out to these groups of people, maybe through church groups or religious groups or other types of groups that can reach out. I think news media in its own may not be able to reach into these sort of echo chambers.
Have you seen anything similar, Yvonne, in the Philippines? Who's doing work that seems to be more effective in going, beyond the misinformation and reaching people and convincing them of the accuracy of the information?
To give credit to the big media houses, I mean, they have been focused on debunking misinformation revolving around COVID-19 pandemic, as well as about the vaccines. And then, of course, you have the verified signatories of the International Fact-Checking Network at Pointer, which is Raptor, Raptor and Verify. So they do a lot of fact-checking and debunking. However, you see, a lot of the disinformation is also on private messaging apps in the Philippines. And that's one area, unlike, say, in other countries like India or Indonesia, where they have like tip lines on WhatsApp, ours circulates mainly on Facebook Messenger and Viber, where it is more difficult to penetrate those fears. So it's a challenge for us. And then at the same time, I also worry because of the resource constraints of the smaller media houses, especially the local community journalists, whether it's radio, television, or newspapers, their ability to actually still focus on these things. I mean, it's already a challenge just to get the news out. What more focusing on what's happening, of course, the disinformation that has been circulating, whether offline or online. Government, of course, has been putting out all their FAQs, but government has also been a major source of disinformation, has been one of the sources of misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic itself. So in that sense, it's very difficult to address the problem. We always say that what we need to fight disinformation and all is a whole of society approach, but it also has to be that people are on the same page, that we acknowledge this is a problem. But if one of the sectors is a big purveyor, and it happens to be the state itself, then that's going to be really difficult to take on, even with all the fact checking and debunking, and even with communities organizing. If you have the state itself and a very popular president at that, something really that we're up against.
Yeah, I just add, I noticed your very interesting diagram where, you know, for certain platforms like TikTok and YouTube, a lot more people look at personalities rather than, you know, news media sites. So you almost need a journalist personality to convey information on these platforms, right? And if you look at a lot of the misinformation, it's actually conveyed by someone who appears with a lot of, you know, persona and, you know, and is able to deliver as if they are a newscaster, you know, so they kind of almost pose like a news organization, although they deliver a lot of misinformation. So I think that, you know, news organizations also, you know, we tend to look at journalism as a bit kind of a sterile, fact-based, and trying to take out the emotion from journalism. But actually, you know, if you want to perform in these platforms, you do need a journalist who's got an exciting personality to convey such information. And maybe that's something that media organizations need to look to.
Yeah, I totally agree with Prem. Media houses really should explore the other platforms and other formats. That's very important. I was looking at the data on the Philippines, you know, TikTok. I mean, I think the newsrooms haven't realized that this is a destination of news for Filipinos. 6% now go to TikTok for news. I mean, and consumption. But when you look at TikTok, there are only like I think just 2 networks. I mean, 2 media houses that are on TikTok. Very few journalists have or projected that this would be the way to go, especially considering that, and you have influencers and you have quite a number of politicians who are already on TikTok deploying this platform. But at the same time, let me point out that there's a lot of rethinking that we have to do, and it requires upskilling and reskilling of journalists. I was looking at just some of the output on TikTok. I mean, there are just DCRH, which is a radio station, and GMA, which has news and public affairs. DCR, which is a radio station, has more a bigger following than GMA News itself, because yes, DCRH employs on cutout for sound, right? Stuff like ideal for Instagram or maybe for Facebook, the Al Jazeera type square thing. So these are things that the media houses have to think about, and we're still quite, I think, a lot of our newsrooms and our audience, but a lot of effort has gone to Twitter. I mean, I think that's also good because we need that. But what many of our newsrooms don't realize is that YouTube is actually the second destination for news. And ABS-CBN, GMA, the leading networks, they've actually of this. They have a huge presence. But
you're breaking out a bit, Yvonne. Sorry.
Not the other mainstream media outlets, especially not print. They're really left far behind. I'm sorry, saying that as far as YouTube, many newsrooms don't realize that this is actually the second biggest destination for news. And only television networks like ABS, GMA, and GMA have invested resources in that. As for the rest, the print especially, and even for radio, they haven't really exploited this platform and have come up with formats that would be suitable for their audiences. Sorry for breaking up. That's how it's like in the Philippines. That's why we spend the longest time on it.
Thanks. Thanks, Yvonne. We got it at the end. So thank you very much. Nick, I wanted to bring you back in a second. So what Prem was mentioning, and it's something that you highlighted in one of those in the slides, right? It's new platform, but it's also personalities. You often mention Sophia Gallo-Smith from the BBC really being having built a personality on TikTok. And that made me think that this personality sort of like approach and personal journalist approach is something we've seen also in podcasts, we've seen in newsletters. What have you, can you tell us more about that, like the rise of this personality across channels, it looks like?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's as you say, it's a bit of a trend in that digital has been something quite sort of clinical. So, you know, people come in and out very quickly on their mobile phones to get a little bit of information, and that's valuable, of course, but you're not really able to build much time or much relationships, and therefore sort of the business becomes very hard of journalism if you just get sort of very small amounts of time. And across countries, you know, we look at sort of maybe people are spending 2% of their time with news now, whereas, you know, in the past with sort of television and print, these were much more time-based medium. So I think definitely one trend we've seen is, as you say, sort of podcasts, which are sort of by definition, they have presenters, you have newsletters that quite often are anchored by somebody now, and they will take you through with a particular tone of voice. And I think that's sort of part of the challenge of the next 10 years or so, 5 years, is how do you sort of build up deeper relationships, and how do you sort of go on beyond just the transactional? The internet is great at getting you to the bit of information quickly that you want, or explaining something, or answering a question, and you're in control. But beyond that, how do you build relationships, and how do you do it in a way that is still, you know, fair and balanced and accurate, rather than tipping over into opinion, which is obviously the danger of the sort of the personality trend. So yeah, I think it's you know, lots of challenges here, but I think lots for journalism to think about how you engage people in these networks.
I'd like to turn to another big subject, which is the one of paying for news. And of course, Nick mentioned in the presentation, and Prem, you mentioned that Malaysiakini is founded like on a reader revenue, and subscription have been growing throughout the pandemic. Can you tell us more about the model of Malaysiakini, of subscription or membership, and what have you seen working during the last year?
Yeah, we kind of double down on subscription. So we engage with a lot of assistants, and we did a lot of thought process. We increased our membership team. We improved our payment flows. So little things here and there have improved and put in a lot of effort, and that has really delivered results. You know, we've nearly doubled our subscription revenue. So very effectively. We also went into much more getting group subscription, corporate subscriptions. You know, working with businesses, institutions, rather than just recruiting the individual subscriber. We've rolled out other services for corporations, etc. So we're kind of moving away, from banner advertising, etc., to more subscription-based services, either to the individual or to corporates. But I think that, reflecting on what Nick showed, I think our big fear is the growth of aggregator apps, or more and more younger people getting it from a distributed means, social media or search. And the question is, how do we get the younger generation to pay, right? I mean, that's we've been doing a lot of subscription on our website, but if people are not going to come to the website, then they're not going to pay for contents. So, for example, is it time for an aggregated subscription type of app where for different subscription sites get together and offer some sort of joint subscription or something like that? So I think these are really the questions that we need to look ahead. A lot of print publications lost out when people moved online, and now that people are moving away from websites, we don't want to lose out again, right? We don't want to be caught in the tail end of this and have someone else conquer the space and then only media move in. So we need to think ahead and think about how do we get younger people to contribute to news. I mean, they're already paying for Spotify, they're already paying for Netflix. Would they pay for some sort of news content? So I think that's my big takeaway, and I think we need to give that. So combining a subscription model with an aggregator app, and getting at least people who are within 30-35 to start paying for some sort of content.
Nick, you've looked at this throughout the years of the demand of people having everything in one place, but the industry hasn't really. We've seen experiments, we've seen attempts, but it hasn't really taken off from an industry side.
Yeah, I mean, I think Prem describes the problem very clearly. There is a small group of people who are really interested in news who will pay directly for a sort of single price subscription. But how do you move beyond that? And how do you? So is that going to be through aggregator apps? Is it going to be through lower prices? I think the industry is really sort of thinking about it, but we haven't seen it yet because the big companies have been building their single price subscriptions, and so they don't want to give the aggregators any content because it will undermine and cannibalize their business while they're still building it. I think at the point you sort of reach the limit of those people who are interested in news, then you are starting to see people now talking about bundling. And it'd be really interesting to see, how that works, because from a consumer point of view, that's what people want. They want frictionless access to lots and lots of different publications. They don't want to be tied down, particularly young people who've grown up with free news from all these different sources. They don't want to be suddenly tied down to a single publication. So that sort of idea of a Spotify for news is something that people want, but the industry is not quite in the right place to provide it yet.
There is a somehow related question in the chat from Daisuke Furuta. It's for you, Nick. Do you think subscription model will work in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, where people can get free news content on the big news aggregators?
I mean, this is true. I mean, Prem was just talking about in Malaysia too, with the mobile aggregators. So this is sort of partly true across Asia, but particularly in countries like Korea, where you have these huge aggregators. And what's interesting is, we're starting to see licensing models now, so that the big platforms pay for content, more exclusive content from particular quality providers. So I think we will definitely, that's a model that's more likely to work in Japan, because there is just not sufficient time with each individual publisher to build those subscription businesses in the way that, for example, there might be in Norway or in the United States. So I think, and it's just interesting that the platforms now have, in fact, it was Korea that really pioneered a lot of those licensing models, where Naver, for example, paid publishers directly for content. But they've moved away from that now, ironically, just as Facebook and Google are starting to pay publishers directly in some countries. So I think we need to watch that over the next year or so, licensing models in addition to direct subscription and membership models.
I wanted to, something which is really a personal curiosity at this point, but I hope it's going to be relevant for everyone. In many of your markets and generally across Southeast Asia, we have publication published sometimes both in English and in other local languages. Prem, have you seen, what kind of differences have you seen between these different audience communities? And especially when you're thinking about the fundings from this year on who is perceived as not fairness represented, or indeed represented at all in the news. What lessons are there from those different from addressing different audiences in different languages?
Yeah, Malaysiakini publishes in 4 languages: English, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. 2 of the languages are subscription based, that's English and Chinese. Whereas our Malay and Tamil language are free because of historical, differences of income and differences of, technology level, technology adoption, etc. And we do see a lot of differences among the community. The English speakers are more liberal-minded, etc. And the Malay community are much more comparing Malaysiakini content with our competitors in the Malay language, and they're very much more into social, Facebook, and video. And I think the political debates within the different communities are different. Also, English is an international language, so our English readers may also be reading in New York Times or following English football, etc. Whereas the Malay readers would be confined to Malay and some amount of Indonesian content because it's very similar. So language is it's quite a factor. Our Chinese readers would also read much more about Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, etc. So we have to play with that. So I think if we do aggregation or groupings or try to understand media, we really need to have that language focus and understand how that particular language group is adopting news and information, and even disinformation tends to circulate among a particular language group more than just generally. So we are, because media is no longer national, it's more globalized. it is the global media is basically languages, whether it's Russian language or Spanish or Malay, Indonesian, etc. So we live in language bubbles, and our competition also is based on language. So we need to kind of look at that and build business models around those languages.
We have just a few minutes left, but Yvonne, I wanted to ask you, very often at conferences or generally around the world, in trends, we look at what comes from Western Europe, from the US in terms of trends. What do you think for our other audiences not based in Asia Pacific, looking at us today? What would be a lesson that you say coming from the region that would be important for others around the world to take note and to learn from?
The biggest issue in the Philippines is really struggling to keep press freedom alive in this era. So, I mean, of course, many other countries face similar problems, but even more so in Southeast Asia. Even if the landscape is pretty uneven, press freedom has been on the decline in many parts of Southeast Asia. And for someone who was born in Southeast Asia's oldest democracy, and Asia's one of Asia's oldest democracy, it's very difficult to see that. I mean, as a journalist, I mean, the decline, I mean, it's heartbreaking. So it's a trend that it just keeps reminding us that, of course, that this is not the first time it's happening, right? We've been through periods where the media has come under great challenge, and we have risen up to the challenge. But it's something that we really have to keep in mind, because whenever the media is under attack, there would be a backlash, including, of course, fear among some journalists to publish, like there is what we always say, the chilling effect. I mean, that has become a very, very popular term in the past few years since the Duterte administration came to power. And something for us to think about. I mean, news consumption will definitely change once we lose our media freedom, right?
Thank you. A very important reminder, Yvonne. Prem, what about you? A lesson for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think that we need to adapt to the younger generation. I think the younger generation needs to be given more space and become more central. I mean, a lot of the issues that we face globally, climate change, inequality, are intergenerational issues. And I think that, especially here in Malaysia, we still have a lot of old-time politicians in the 90s still ruling the roost. And it's time that, that we really work with younger people and give them a louder voice. And I believe that, that generational transition is really important for democracy, for press freedom, and they have a lot to say. So I think that that's something. Asia is a very young country, a young continent. So let's give the young people more voice.
Thank you so much. Perfectly on the hour. Thank you very much, Prem, Yvonne, and Nick, for joining us. For those following us, you find a full report at digitalnewsreport.org/2021. And this year we've also done a podcast, 6 episodes, where you can find and meet the different authors of different chapters of the report, and to doing deep dives on the different topics. So you can find them on Spotify podcast app.
If I could just add quickly that the report was really great. I really liked the report. It's very well done, and especially, as I mentioned earlier, I really liked the way it was presented online. I think it's a great example that we should all follow. So well done to the whole team.
Yeah, and I'm very proud to be part of the project again. Thank you, Nick and Federica. Thanks
so much. We're very happy to have you, and thank you so much for taking the time to join in this webinar today. Thank you and goodbye.